We are about to begin the post-lunch session. See, the panelists are waiting for you. So please take your seats. Unlike other sessions, I haven't had the chance to ask them to be on the stage. I'll just quickly make the announcement and we'll get on with it. No literature festival can be complete without a discussion on India-China. It's one of the most salivating discussions and I'm really looking forward to it. After the beautiful sessions in the morning, this is an explosive one that, you know, there's a dessert for your lunch. And without further ado, we have the panelists, some of the brilliant minds on China, Kanti Bajpai, Ananth Krishnan, Alex Travelli, on India's China challenge. And speaking to them would be Suhasini Haider. Can India-China ties be resilient or renewed in the face of the ongoing border standoff? That's the subject we're going to be discussing. So over to Suhasini to take on the session. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Prabal, and thank you very much to all the organizers it's called the Kasoli Lit Fest, but I know it's the Khushwant Singh Literary Fest. And I'm just going to start by saying I know this is a tough session to do because it's the post-lunch session. Everyone's feeling a little sluggish, but we're going to try and heat things up a bit with a discussion on India and China, which I think in many ways, and you know, I've spent much of my reporting career on India-Pakistan, but I think the heat that comes out of the India-China relationship in some ways is much, much more, and for a number of reasons, which we're going to discuss in this session today. I'd also like to start by complimenting the organizers for their geopolitical timing and their understanding of what's going on right now, because for the last 4 years, as Prabal said, India and China have had a military standoff. We've seen masses of soldiers on both sides off the line of actual control. We've seen the first casualties in 45 years, when at least 20 Indian soldiers and we don't know how many Chinese soldiers were killed in a clash at Galwan. Many believe that China has aggressed and occupied Indian territory, that they are denying access to Indians to those territories. And we've seen 4 years now of negotiations to try and settle this situation, and many, many months of impasse. So a lot of very, very strong comments made by both sides. But at the end of the day, the negotiations have continued. And that's why this is an important moment we're standing at today, because as of Tuesday, on the 22nd, Prime Minister Modi is traveling to Russia. President Xi Jinping is traveling to Russia. The question on everyone's mind is not really what they're going to do in Russia, but whether they're going to meet each other. Because for the last few months, we've seen definitely an uptick in the kind of negotiations between the two countries. We've seen the foreign ministers meet twice. We've met the National Security Advisor meet their senior leadership. We've seen the committees of the MEA, the MOD, the military, all meeting. We're waiting on some sort of a border commanders meeting, military commanders meeting as well. But this is a moment where things could go either way. So this is a good moment to try and discuss whether there's an alternate future in the India-China relationship. And of course, tensions have been there for so many decades. It's not just about the moment, of course, that we want to have at this session, because we have these brilliant authors and writers who have covered not just, you know, I have this joke about how everyone's an expert on India-China, but it's a question of who's the expert on China itself, and more of those that we need over here. I want to take maybe a broader view of the China challenge, not just for India. It is a challenge, but also for the world, what's happening in the last few years. and also China's potential. Why is it so difficult? If we all think of China as a challenge, if we all think, as External Affairs Minister Jai Shankar said, that the world has a China problem, or they're trying to work with that Chinese problem. Of course, there was a response from there as well to that comment. Why is it so difficult to de-risk and disengage if it is such a challenge? It is the world's second largest economy. It's the world's second largest economy with the world's biggest military. So I'm going to go for a round of questions where I want each of our authors to really talk about their work, so you get a sense of where we stand today in terms of China. Ananth, your book is, of course, called India's China Challenge. So we took that for the title of the session as well. It's a journey through China's rise and what it means for India. Of course, Ananth has lived on and off in China since 2008. So he really, really has a perspective on the ground. In many ways, that was China's peak. It was the golden period. They had the Olympics. There was so much around the world. There was so much talk about China. Everyone was trying to get to know China or to deal with China. There was a lot of people coming away impressed with how China had grown. And then we saw things change, maybe from 2012 or so. We saw the wolf warriors of China come about. We saw the Chinese aggression economically, and then there was the territorial aggressions. Once the Chinese president said, we will ensure that we take back every inch of what is China's territory, we saw China making moves, not just, of course, the LAC is one, but also in the South China Sea and other neighbors of China. So I want to start by asking you, Ananth, what do you think spurred that change in China, and where do you think China is headed now?
Thank you, Suhasini, and thank you to the organizers as well. I think it's a very important moment to be speaking about the India-China relationship. And I think that resilience and renewal is a very good description of where things are now. I think resilience is something that India is going to need in the next 30, 40 years as it deals with the new relationship with China. And it's also a moment of renewal because, in my view, I think the relationship now is at its worst since the 1962 war, which should be something that concerns everyone in this room. And I think that the relationship is now in a very unsustainable place. So I think it's important for us to look at how we got here and where we go from here. I like the point that you made where everyone's an India-China expert. There's a lot of interest in India and India-China relations, but one thing that I find quite puzzling as someone who's been living in China for a while is I don't see the same level of interest or attention, even expertise when it comes to what's happening in China or understanding China on its own terms, in terms of whether it's politics in China, or the economy, or society, or culture. You don't really get that much of investment. And I think that, that's something which I find a little problematic because unless you have a deep understanding of what's driving changes in China, I think it's difficult to have a layered understanding of what's driving the Chinese when it comes to dealing with India. So I think you can't ignore one and focus on the other, which is one reason why I wanted to write this book. So I moved to China first in 2008, and I wanted to stay there for 3 months, learn a little bit of Mandarin, then come back. It ended up being now 15 years. Beijing is still a home for me, and I'm back and forth quite a bit. And every time I would come back to India, the thing that would strike me is that the questions that I would get from people, or even the observations that they had about China, were so far removed from my own sort of lived experience there and the day-to-day of what it was like to be there. So I kind of wanted to do a book that would present, an on-the-ground perspective of what was happening in China and told, using Chinese voices, as a reporter should do. And I think I was lucky to move there, as you said. It was a year after the Olympics in Beijing, and I think it was a rare window of openness when they were trying to show their sort of best foot forward, their best face to the world. And the thing that shocked me was how open people were, in contrast to the sort of impressions we had in terms of willing to speak to an Indian reporter. But Unfortunately, I think that would change around 2012-13 when the current leader of China, Xi Jinping, took over. And I think all the progress towards openness that you saw kind of began to regress. But at the same time, what I also really wanted to do in the book is kind of try and challenge some of the conventional wisdoms that we have about China. Just for example, the fact that we think of a country that is, very monochromatic, a monolith, but then a country that I found was very diverse. If you travel, just like in India, at the level of the states, provinces, even the cuisine, from one area to another. And I think the biggest thing that strikes any Indian who goes to China is that the food is nothing like what we get here. And that's a good thing. And even things
It's
like
not what we call Indian Chinese.
Absolutely, fortunately not. Or even the fact that, people in India try to think, we should emulate the Chinese model by having, a centralized, authoritarian kind of government, when actually, China's growth story and economic reforms took off when they actually retreated from centralization and they had experimentation and opening up in the 80s. So that was something that struck me as well, which I think people sometimes misread the China story. Or the fact that, we think of China as an adversary, but for an Indian who lives there on the ground, the questions you get from Chinese, I can't recall being asked about the 62 war or even Pakistan. I would be asked about Raj Kapoor. I'd be asked about, Indian films, because for the fact that for a whole generation of Chinese in the 60s and 70s, when they were close to the West, the only movies they got were from India. So you had a very different perspective from what you would, get. So I think one thing that I think we all really need to do is have a more on-the-ground understanding, but that comes from having more people on the ground in China. And that's very difficult, understandably, at this moment, given the problems we're having in the relationship, which I'm sure we'll speak about. Very briefly, Suhasini, I'll just quickly list out what I think I would flag as 4 challenges we have with China. I think some of my fellow speakers will take that forward. I think, firstly, there's a political challenge of the relationship, of dealing with a country that's very different political system. And as you also said, one that right now is trying to shape the world order in alignment with its views and interests, which in some cases align with India's and which in some cases do not. It's important for us to understand what those points of agreement and divergence are. I think there's an economic challenge as well. Despite the difficulties in the relationship, we are buying more from China today than ever in history. The last 2 years, India imported more from China than ever before. We are more dependent on all kinds of goods from China, not just cheap goods, but electrical machinery, very important ingredients we need for our pharma sector. We're still very, very dependent on China, and we should explore how that happened while we have a difficult political relationship, and how do we get out of that. And I think most interestingly, there is also a problem of perception. This is something that Kanti speaks about in his book, in terms of 2 countries that have deep misperceptions, that look at each other very differently. And I think the only way to bridge that gap is to have a lot more of research, reporting, on-the-ground exchanges, 2-way interactions. So I kind of wrote the book as a plea for that. So I'll stop there.
All right. And it certainly does sound as if there is a little bit of a love story with China. And what you've seen of its culture. Just give me a quick sense of what do you think is the most startling for you in terms of how the Chinese people have changed. I'm not talking about their government or their militaries, but how have the Chinese people actually changed, or something you see? Because we see China on one side, of course, we see with the aggression and what we're dealing with at the line of actual control, but we also see its immense technological progress. Also, of course, a little frightening, the idea of surveillance, the idea that your WeChat account is connected to absolutely everything, and you can walk into a restaurant and they'll do a biometrics on you and tell you exactly what you ordered the last time. So what do you think is the biggest change there?
On the surveillance question, I still use WeChat since I live in China, so there's a good sense that what we're saying is being heard by somebody somewhere. But I think that it is, on a serious note, this might be an idealistic view, but not just with China, but with any of our neighbors. I always have the view that you have to separate the people from the government. I think that governments aren't permanent anywhere, including in China. And I think it would be foolish to think that India will forever be dealing with the same government in China. So I do feel it's a bit unfortunate that the first thing that we tend to do when we have political problems with the country is we jettison, everything else. Just to give an example, we've more or less expelled all the Chinese students who are studying in India. We've expelled the Chinese journalists who are in India, as a result of which Indian journalists like myself were expelled from China last year. So I think that we have to look at, as you said, beyond the level of the government, establishing durable linkages at the level of universities, education, to name a few, technology. We still have an impression of China being the world's factory, but it's now a tech power as well, if you look at what they're doing with. The thing that shocks me every time I go to Beijing, or when I did recently for the first time after the pandemic, was the sheer number of electric vehicles on the roads, which now outnumber the regular cars. So I think there's a lot more beyond the politics. This is not to discount the politics. It's a very serious political relationship. There are very serious military problems that need to be addressed head on. But I think that you have to have a much more varied and layered view of dealing with a country that can't be wished away as a neighbor as well.
Absolutely, and a 3,500 kilometer boundary. Ananth has that still positive view. I have to tell you, Kanti's book is a slightly pessimistic one. It's entitled India versus China, why they aren't friends, why they are not friends. And Kanti really looks at various factors in the relationship that show why they are not friends. Perceptions, their perimeters, their other partnerships, and of course, the power asymmetry that we see today. So my simple question is going to be, Kanti, can they be friends in the future at all, or even that is difficult?
Yeah, well, thanks very much for the simple question. I hope, Ananth, that your WeChat's on, and I'm addressing 1.4 billion Chinese as well on this, but because they won't translate the book and have it available there. They can be friends, but with difficulty. This book was commissioned to present the pessimistic view, in a sense. So I'm a bit more optimistic than the book title indicates. But my charter was to write a book in 2020, a month after Galwan, and I had to write in 3 months, on why, in a sense, they couldn't be friends, or why it was so difficult, and why things had gone wrong spectacularly in the summer of 2020. I'm just going to talk about these 4 Ps very quickly. They're related, but in the book, because I was a lazy kind of person, I couldn't trace through the exact ways in which the 4 Ps are interrelated, but I think you can work it out for yourself. It's a little algorithm, just an easy way to try and think about the India-China relationship beyond just the border issue, which I wanted to get away from. And this is why I so enjoyed Anand's book as well, which I bought last night, and I've been reading non-stop since. So what are the 4 Ps? The first one is perceptions or images of each other historically. And what you see there, tracing it through from the time Buddhism went to China, is that for about 500 or 600 or 700 years, China looked up to India because it was the land of Buddha. And there's even some evidence that their appellation Chongguo, which refers to the Middle Kingdom, was used to refer to parts of India that were, spiritually central. But by the 15th or 16th century, as Buddhism had kind of gone into remission in India, but was vigorous in China, in any case, by the 15th or 16th century, China as a great maritime power and a great imperial power was drawing tribute from various Indian kingdoms in Bengal, in southern India. So China looked up to India for several hundred years, and then for a couple of hundred years at least, if not longer, they were tribute-sending Indians who looked up to China. And then the Europeans came along, and in a way the relationship was broken with China until about really the 19th century,
when a lot of negative things happened from the Chinese perspective related to India, which is that British Indian troops and policemen were in India. Of course, the famous drug trade, as it were, from India into China, which devastated Chinese society, occurred. There were sort of images of unscrupulous Indian businessmen working in China and so on. So quite a negative opinion arose. But I think it climaxed in about the late 19th century when young Chinese intellectuals, facing the possibility of China becoming an India, being subordinated by the Europeans, asked themselves, what happened to this great civilization in Southern Asia, to their west? And young intellectuals there said, oh my God, India, a chaotic place, became a slave nation. And they lamented it, but there was also a kind of a tinge of contempt there for India. And I think as we project forward, some of that attitude has remained, although it's inflected differently in contemporary times. There's still a sort of a feeling that India is some kind of rather dirty, messy, unfathomable, not very interesting or exciting place to go to. And it's tinged with racism and ignorance. And of course, in large part, or in quite substantial part, there are Indians who repay, the mutual contempt, racist or ignorance or otherwise. I mean,
you're right about the Asan.
Yeah, the Asan. And then if you look at some of the behavior during COVID and so on, it wasn't pretty in India, associating the virus with, the Chinese virus and so on. So treatment of Chinese Indians during the '62 war also was quite a bad moment in terms of the way we reacted to people of Chinese origin. So the first problem is there's quite a big perception or image problem on both sides. These are very slow to change. So all the things that Ananth talks about, I endorse, but they're very slow to change. So if we want to be friends, that's going to be a bit of a long haul. The second P is perimeters. That's borders. And I think that's a very long story. But it seems to me that at the heart of the problem there is Tibet, because it's Tibet that borders India. And it's Tibet that's such a difficult point for the Chinese, a great vulnerability even now. And indeed, we may be coming to a time when things will sharpen even further, because sadly, obviously, the present Dalai Lama will pass from the stage, a new Dalai Lama will be chosen, and there will be a moment when Chinese will put forward, inevitably, I think, a Dalai Lama, and there may be another Dalai Lama nominated by Tibetans elsewhere and others, and India will have to, in a sense, will be under pressure to make a choice. But whenever I think of the problem around the border, I think of the domestic problem of China around Tibet. And I can only see it sharpening. That's one, I think, very serious problem. My short point about the border is I think that both sides know what the solution is, more or less. But because of Tibet, and because today there's no leader of the size of Deng Xiaoping or Mao or Nehru or whatever in India who can sell that potential agreement, it's going to be very difficult. I'll come back to say something about what a deal could look like. But it's not just a border deal. It would have to be, as Ananth said, a much larger political adjustment and even a security adjustment. The third P is partnerships. So Russia, the Soviet Union in the Cold War, the United States, India, and China have always been part of a kind of geopolitical quadrilateral. But the most striking thing about those four powers together is that in this entire period from 1949, they're the only two, give or take a period of entente between them, particularly against the Americans in the 50s and 60s and then after the Cold War. These are the only two that have never been strategic partners against either Russia or the United States. Which means that at the sort of grand strategic level of decision-making, high political, high military, and so on, they've never had that kind of lips-to-teeth engagement that perhaps the Chinese and the Americans had in the second half of the Cold War, or the Soviets and the Chinese had in the first half of the Cold War, and perhaps they have today. So these are the only two that have always been on opposite sides of this kind of set of strategic partnerships. And I think that's another very important. They have no military geopolitical capital, as it were, to draw on to get them over bad times because they've never been partners. The last P is the one that, we talk about the most, and it's the most evident, and so I won't say a lot about it, but just to sketch it in for a moment, and that is the power asymmetry. So in 1980, I think it's pretty clear that at least at the economic level, perhaps even at the military level, except in respect of nuclear weapons, India and China were more or less balanced even. But since then, we know that the Chinese economy in nominal terms today, in GDP terms, is 5 times India's size. Per capita income, roughly also about 5 times India's. And the absolute difference in their economies is about $17 trillion today. Even if China slows down on a base of $21 trillion, and India grows 8 or 9% on a base of $3 trillion, as a value add every year means that the gap with China in an absolute sense will grow, it won't reduce. In hard power terms, that is military terms, I think what the good news here, ironically, is that as the economies have pulled away, geography helps us on the military front, at least for, I would say, the next decade or so. It's just so hard to fight up there in the Himalayas. You can't do a lot. You can't win much and you can't lose much. And that's, I think, a great solace to us here in India. And in the maritime space, geography helps us again, because it's a long way from Hainan base, where the Chinese Navy egress from, into the Bay of Bengal in the Indian Ocean. They have long supply lines, and the Indians are quite well placed. Again, at least for the next decade or so, it seems to me. On soft power, or maybe we'll leave that to Q&A, it's interesting that on some measures of soft power that are out there that people have done, India scores rather poorly. And one of the reasons it does, it seems to me, is that the very thing that some extol India for, which is open, pluralistic, democratic, and relatively liberal, many countries around the world and societies actually look to China for the opposite reason. A very well-ordered, highly well, I wouldn't say, centralized necessarily, but as Ananth said, but far more so than India. And so for countries that want to fast-track development, they look at China and they say, hey, that's what we want to be, and we'll look after the democracy problem later. And when they look at India, on the other hand, it's like somewhat stumbling along, and they think democracy gets in the way. They may be right and they may be wrong on that, but that's their perception, you see. So even on the soft power, I think now the implication, and this is my last point on the asymmetry of power, is this, that in a sense, because the Chinese are so far ahead, they have a bit of a sense of, why should we make a compromise when we're so much more powerful than India? Let the Indians come to us. And on the Indian side, precisely because we're so relatively weak, there's a sense that any concession we might want to make reasonably would be portrayed as a surrender and might be the slippery slope to more compromises or concessions. So the Chinese won't concede because they're superior in power, and we won't concede or compromise because we're afraid it'll amount to a surrender. So that's a real structural problem. So I think the most dynamic issue is a border settlement, which is most in our hands, and maybe I'll say something about how that could be achieved later.
All right, and that's certainly very interesting. That bit you were speaking about how Chinese perceive Indian democracy, because that's something we are so proud of. But I think in Shyam Saran's book, where he writes about how China sees India, he tells the story of this very senior Politburo member who comes to India, I think in the 1960s. And they are going to Nalanda, and they're going to see some of the Buddha's relics and things. And they're on a road where there is a protest. And the protesters take over the entire road, and they're doing a satyagraha, dharna, sitting right there. At some point, there's a police convoy going, and all these very high-powered Chinese delegates in that convoy. So it wouldn't have been the 60s, it must have been the 50s, because I'm sure we wouldn't take them after the war. As they approach this crowd, and it's a huge, massive crowd that has come in Bihar to protest, they have no idea who's in the cars. They slow down, at which point the police official who is taking the convoy goes up to the crowd and they say, no, we're not going to move. We've done a chakka jam. We've done a rasta roko. We're not going to move. The trains had been stopped. Everything had been stopped there. And so the police officer folds his hands and says, you know, we've got guests over here. Hamare mehman aaye hue hain. So, you know, please just let us go. It looks so bad. And the crowd agrees. And they drive through. Now, for most of us, we'd say, well, that's quite a nice story. Shyam Saran actually got a copy of what he had written back home to say it's horrific. There is no law and order in this country. The police are bowing before the people, and they're allowing them to sort of ride roughshod over them. So it's about perceptions. The things we hold dear are not necessarily what they hold dear. And then, as a result, we see each other in a more derisive light. So I come to Alex now. Alex, you've been based in Hong Kong as a reporter. You frequently return to China. Alex is the South Asia business and economic correspondent for the New York Times, based in Delhi. And of course, what you've written about a lot is not just China's influence and engagement in South Asia, where of course India has a challenge with its South Asian neighbors as well. Alex is just back from Bangladesh. But also particularly interesting are Alex's writings on India-China comparisons. So I do want to ask, to start with Alex, India has now surpassed China in something. What is that something? Population. How long before, or will we ever be able to reach their economic levels?
Thank you, Suhasini, and thanks to the organizers. I'm not a proper book writer, as your other two guests are, but I've been writing a series that sort of at the last minute we decided in the newspaper to slugline with India's economic promise. And this was from sometime after the G20, during a period, which we're still very much in, and you'll all appreciate this, where the rest of the world, I don't mean China and I don't mean only India itself, but I'm writing mainly for an American audience, also Europe, also in Africa and Southeast Asia. People are very excited about India's economic promise. Looks more promising than ever. But I feel that the headline or the slug line is missing something, and it's confused me as I've tried to figure out what each next installment in the series should be, because none of them quite sound right. I mean, if we just wanted to tour India's economic promise, we could be writing forever. How many different aspects are there of this economy, of the business environment? No, what actually the outside world wants to, neither of these two giants wants to know is India the next China? When will India be the next China? Can it hurry on already and be the next China? And this is, for me, I've been based in India now for more than 10 years, and it's been my chief interest as a journalist for something like 25. It's a frustrating question. I know enough about China to tell you in two dimensions why it's so frustrating. These countries are radically unlike one another. It's a funny coincidence in the broadest strokes of history that they happen to have exactly the same population at this moment, 1.4 billion, who really knows who's ahead, though undoubtedly India will be for the next 500 years plus. It's crazy. There's no other civilization with anything like that historical depth or breadth, and they're next door neighbors. So you can appreciate as inevitable the question, the series of questions that come from faraway places that seem to conflate the two countries or think they might be interchangeable. Now, so it's useful for me to keep that in mind. You live in one country for long or travel between the two, and the differences overwhelm you. But from where my editors, so many of my readers sit, it's kind of hard to keep them straight. Which of these two five-letter countries is which? The useful thing then is to think, and I think this has become especially clear since about maybe 2020, certainly since 2022, there's an immense interest in China displacement effects for American readers, for everyone in the world. It's less changes that have happened in India, which most of them happily have been rather gradual for the past 10 or 15 years, than rather the very abrupt and frightening changes that have happened to China, economically especially, and geopolitically. So when I say China displacement effects, it's kind of my own coinage. I'm talking about two very different kinds of things. Look at it from indulge me in an American point of view. There's the geopolitical effect. These are people who, in the security establishment and the diplomatic establishment, who will often talk, or if they say it freely or not, they'll talk behind closed doors about India as a counterweight to China. Since Xi Jinping's era has begun, with increasing rapidity, these big sort of Cold War trained thinkers suppose that there needs to be something like a China containment strategy. The Quad is one marquee level example of that. What do India, Japan, America, and Australia have in common? You could say democracy, but that's really not it. It's a and Vietnam should join the club too, and then you really can't say it's democracy. It's a long-termist China containment strategy, and with that in mind, pretty much everything else you could say or do or think about India becomes fine print. Now that's frustrating for someone who knows about India or is trying to know more about India. It means that people who are basically China monomaniacal Cold Warriors are the ones who are most interested in India policy. On the other hand, and this is again a China displacement policy, again coming from elite policy-making circles in the U.S., say a similar thing about Europe, there's the finance elite, which would like not so much a counterweight to China's power in the world, frightening as it becomes aggressive around its borders or as America indulges in trade wars with it. They would rather see India as a replacement for China. And this is maybe the much of the business world. It's perhaps equally unlikely to come to pass, but there's a really strong motive force for it. Strong enough that even though I work within that world, I keep being surprised by it. It became really pronounced, to my mind, with the start of the Ukraine war. China's current economic crises, I would argue, got going during the COVID era when, and the period after our COVID era when they were persisting in zero COVID. But a lot of longer brewing problems started to come to light then. However, for this China displacement set, this third group sitting outside these two countries, it was the Ukraine war that really snapped minds to attention, because that's when Russia becomes uninvestable. And China, however closely yoked they are to Russia's war cause, is starting to give off indications that it might become uninvestable. Well, there's a hell of a lot of free-floating capital in the world that's going to need a new home if it's not going to keep its current bets or its long-standing now bets on China's economy. A lot of the more interesting things that we've seen happen to India, especially in the financial markets, especially in the last 2 years, have been rather direct effects to do with that. So, for instance, the way our stock markets in India move around right now. They're in a very strange condition. As has been mentioned, China's economy is 5 times bigger than India's. A lot of details are unclear, but that much we're pretty clear on. India's public markets, however, I hope you all own some share in them, have been booming so hard, so steadily, that they're now almost half the size of China's, 5.5 trillion US as against about 11 trillion US. And that's in part because Indian shares are historically extremely overvalued. They're trading at 23 times price to earnings. China's at a much more modest 9 times. And so, when, I'm talking about the last few weeks, these stimulus measures get introduced in China that in various ways a lot of people hope, depending on the size of the stimulus and details that escape me, might save the property market, might put more money in the hands of consumers. Obviously everyone in China is excited about it. Everyone who watches China is excited about it. And then the next day, India's frothy market plunges. And then it comes back after a few days when people in China start to complain that the stimulus isn't enough. And then the Chinese announce another stimulus. India's market plunges. It's not that India's fundamentals are in any way harmed by this. If anything, they're helped. But there's hot money right now that's zipping around Asia and can't decide where to sit still. And that's going to affect all of us who are making our livelihoods in India for many years to come. So I go back to my series, which is more about ways in which India is genuinely starting to look a bit like China was looking, 15 years ago. If you look at electronics manufacturing, to choose just one example, in Tamil Nadu or in Noida, you start to see factories that remind a lot of old China hands of things that they saw there during China's boomiest boom years. And everyone in the world wants to know what's going to come of that, what knock-on effects there are. But go back to my slug line, it's India's economic promise. It's not quite fair. It only looks sensible to the American reader written that way. What we're really talking about is India and China and how do they weigh against each other? Who replaces whom? Can they replace each other? What the big China-India brains we actually have know and can tell us easily is these two countries are different. For a million reasons, they're not going to become the same thing. India is becoming more and more important in the world, and there's no doubt that that will continue. But I would like to tell my readers in simpler language than I manage once and for all, India's path to growth will be a different one. It's not going to be a replay.
All right. Very interesting. Can I just extrapolate from what you're saying? Because from what I understand, India's strength or its USP is in being the un-China. So in other words, having a growth pattern like China's or a manufacturing base like China's is not necessarily what's going to keep people's interest, particularly, as you said, after Russia and Ukraine. But the fact that India remains a democracy, India remains a secular country, India remains a pluralistic, rule-abiding, open country. I mean, is that what you're somewhere there saying?
I'm not really saying that.
Okay, I'm putting those
I
words
won't
in your
stop you
mouth
from
then.
saying that, but I actually think that on the geopolitics side, what these China-containing allies want is a heavyweight, and the nature of government is a secondary concern. Like I said, and it's a funny example to pick on Vietnam that way, but Vietnam would be a very welcome member to this club. Never mind that their system of government is modeled after, yeah. And as far as the business finance types go, there's a bit of a schizoid attitude. Yes, they want sometimes simplistically India to beat China, and they'll look at the steps in China's recent industrialization and think, oh, why can't India just follow the same program, as it were? But there's also an awareness that here's the biggest problem with India replacing China. It's nothing to do with what goes on in India or what goes on in China. It's that there's already China. You can't become the factory floor to the world when there is a factory floor to the world, and no one really foresees that ending.
So we have to chart that different course. Now, I just want to see with a show of hands how many people have questions, because we can keep having this chat for a very long time. But I see that there are questions out there. So let's take that first, and then maybe we'll come back for final thoughts with a show of hands. Okay, why don't you go first, sir? Do you want to just stand up? And I'm not sure there is a mic coming to you. Give us a second.
Ma'am, first I must give a disclaimer. I commanded the Western Army, looked after the Sikkim frontier, and was facing China's in parts of Himachal and border and that. Wonderful exposition, lot of romanticism, but the problem is we are trying to deal with people who have no voice in decision making. The entire decision making, it would be exact replication of what we are trying to do with Pakistan. Trying to put shamas and all, but the military establishment doesn't want a peace. So, good, we also want to romanticize. And now that I've shed uniform, I want to romanticize more.
I can assure you, nobody over here is really much of a romantic when it comes to dealing with the Chinese military.
Yeah, so ma'am, through you, I want to ask the one most enlightening, for me who studies China every day, very enlightening for me, wonderful exposition. But I want your answer on this. When people have no voice, how do we deal with it? What kind of future are we looking at?
That's a great question. Thank you. I'm going to try and take a few more so that you have a few questions to respond to. But please come forward. Maybe the gentleman there. And then I think there's a gentleman here.
Good evening. I'm Bhupendra, this side. You can look to your left. Yeah, thank you. This is somewhere when Mr. Bajpai remarked that there is a solution which is available, and then you remembered great Deng Xiaoping and Mr. Nehru. Probably they had the solution, but don't you think Mr. Nehru was a part of the problem? Thank you.
That's a simple question to answer, I'm sure. There was one gentleman there, Mr. Jha, I think is right there. Yeah, please give him the mic. And then we'll come to the gentleman there, yeah. And I'll take...
I just have a very small question to ask. Just stand up. Alex, you know, you're talking about replacing China, replacing this. What does replacement mean? Because I frankly, in a completely interdependent world, any replacement of one country by another involves war, conflict, destruction. And is that really what the great thinkers, strategists in the US and China, and for that matter in NATO, are thinking about? Can you hear me?
Yes.
I always do this. My hand keeps falling down. So this idea, where is the need to replace something in a country with another country? Is it economic that you're talking about? Is it cultural? It could be both. But I would like to think it's both, actually. But I mean, if it's military, then I'm really seriously worried.
All right. I have three really great questions, but I am gender partisan, so I'm looking for a question from one of the ladies in the audience, if there is one. Well, if there isn't one, I'll come to the gentleman in the front here, and then we'll come to you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am an ex-army captain. My course-mates, they have retired as generals. The Chashul War, my regiment got this Battle of Honor for Chashul. Presently, it is in Arunachal, posted in eastern sector. Don't you think that the politicians, it is a compulsion of the politicians, like Modi ji, the present Prime Minister says, na koi ghusa hai, na ghusne denge. Because in case he accedes to the allegations of the opposition, then he will be out. The Congress and the opposition parties will take him down.
All right.
And shouldn't there be a confederation? Because you see, trillions and trillions of money has been spent on this wars and other things. And this money can be spent for the positivity, for the positive progress of all these countries. In case there's a confederation, in the sense, all the Pakistan and China and other countries, they get together and they find a solution.
All right. Interesting take. No, I'm sorry. I've got a gentleman behind you, and he's been holding the mic for a bit. Please go ahead, sir.
Good afternoon. I am Gurinder. And thank you. Yesterday also, it started with politics. Two speakers were here. I was not very much satisfied because one of the speakers, though he's my party colleague, at the very outset he said that India almost kept itself away from First and the Second World War. Though in First World War, we contributed 1.5 million army persons, and Second World War around 2.5 million.
So I'm going to ask you to have a question because we're really running out of time, and Kanti is getting on a train, so he won't be able to answer your question.
Okay, I'll be asking this question based to Kanti ji only. That one thing, that we are talking about trade. Now China is the largest trade partner in 2024, toppling USA. I just want to ask question. We asked one thing, twice, third. I just want to know that politics, trade, leaving aside, the string of pearls document which China is following, will it be lost in trade, or they will keep dominating or circling us as Russia is being encircled by NATO?
All right, thank you. I'm going to start with you, Kanti, because I know that you have to leave on the dot. And, you can see that many of the questions are really about the LAC stand-up. I'm sorry. We
So
really
are we going to have, if we have a
No,
Kra
sorry,
canal?
Sir. Sorry, sir. I'm not going to allow you to ask a question. There was a lady over there, so if you have a very quick question, please go ahead.
Hi, sorry, I'm going to be very quick. My question's for Alex. What do you think about India's participation in the Quad Alliance and its growing relationship with the US? Do you think it increases friction between India and China?
Okay, thank you. Kanti, go ahead.
Not sure which one I'm answering, but I guess the one I'll say something about first is the possibility of some kind of a deal. And I won't take on the Nehru issue. I think it's pretty well recorded that it was a complex time. He made mistakes. He got some things right and he got some things wrong. So did the Chinese. On both sides, neither side was quite sure of their maps. And by the time they were, positions had hardened over various things. And mistakes were made on both sides, including by Nehru. But I think more importantly at this point, let's look at the possibility of a deal. I think both sides and probably everyone here can name the broad outlines of the deal, which is the swap, in some fashion or the other, with some adjustments here and there. That is the Western sector, the Chinese more or less get to keep their claims. India gets to keep more or less all its claims in the eastern sector, which is Arunachal Pradesh. And there's a relatively simple problem in the middle sector in Himachal, UP or Uttarakhand. And then, I guess I'm assuming Sikkim is more or less settled, but perhaps not. But there might be some adjustments somewhere in and around there. But what would be the deal? I mean, it can't be simply the territorial swap. The Chinese have always said, and I think India has come round to the view that there's a much bigger issue that has to be settled. And I think it really relates to Tibet in the end. And as I said earlier, we're coming to a difficult time. And I think it'll have to be that, and this is hard and possibly controversial, but India will have to kind of sign off, as it were, on Tibet, which is to say, more or less accept, the Chinese, I would say, nominee for the Dalai Lama. I think if that doesn't happen, then Tibet is still alive between the two. Of course, that's a difficult decision internally in India, and it'll be difficult for the Tibetan diaspora, perhaps, and other countries who have people, of Tibetan Buddhist sort of leanings in the faith. But I think that will be one very hard call, and if it can't be made, then a deal will be very difficult. The Chinese on their side, I think, what is it? The crucial thing about this is, as some Chinese interlocutors have said, what is it that India can give us that they can't take back? So that's one thing, the Tibet deal. We could ask the same thing of the Chinese, which is what is the one thing they can give us that they can't really take back that would sex up the deal? And I think that is, they have to come out once and for all openly and support us to get the UN Security Council permanent veto membership, and they can't take it back. And I think that symbolically, politically, diplomatically would be the kind of... The last point relates to Tawang, which is a real problem, and perhaps some internationalization of Tawang that is given an international personality of some kind. So perhaps the Chinese get, real access to and perhaps some sort of control over the monastery, but the governance of the district of Tawang still remains under India. And that's some kind of a secondary swap that allows the deal to go through.
You're talking about win-win solutions, but you know that the Chinese mean both wins are theirs. Alex, you got some questions for yourself.
Thanks. Let me answer the two that were directed to me. To the gentleman, about replacement, I want to go back to the distinction I made between the military establishment, who talks about finding a counterweight to China. For them, it's not about replacement, unless in the sense that China replaces the Soviet Union or Al-Qaeda as a #1 security threat. It's the business and finance elites who are looking to replace their reliance on China. The sensible ones don't want to replace it wholesale. They want to do, actually it's often crammed under the banner of resilience. They want redundancy of supply lines. They want factories. If Foxconn is going to build these parts we need, why can't they build them in India? We're sure that they won't be, there's a lot of certainty, it's thought, relatively, having supply lines outside of China, especially these past 4 years. That's the big replacement that they're looking for. And then, sorry?
The quad question.
Yeah, the quad question for the lady in Reading, in Reading. I think it's certainly the case, and we can probably look at the timeline of it and see that it's a huge irritant to China. I'd love to hear if Suhasini disagrees. Whenever India shows itself to be a part of the Quad, it's amazing and kind of hilarious that India can be both part of the SCO, where Suhasini was this week, and the Quad at the same time, but somehow it works. However, that's not to say it's an obstacle to India and China striking a mutually beneficial deal. Often it seems like the greatest irritants are, for each of these parties, putting chips on the table. And, you know, if you're going to engage in gusabaz here, we're going to play this quad footsie here. And you can give us what we want there, and maybe we'll consider giving what you want there. So it's definitely not something they enjoy, but I'm not sure it's a long-term obstacle.
And yeah, and if you could, and also because we had agreed to get you to speak a little bit about the possibility, if Prime Minister Modi and President Xi meet on Tuesday, that's a big if they come to some kind of an agreement, it seems very unlikely at present. What's the first area that India and China can tackle when it comes to restoring ties?
Sure. Before answering that, I just wanted to speak to the first question, which I completely agree with, in the sense that I think the big mistake that I see is we tend to veer from romanticism, which I think is misplaced, to the other extreme, which is a conviction that they're going to end up in war. So I think what has been missing is approaching China from a layered realist perspective. And I think a realist perspective means, on the one hand, building your military and being prepared when it comes to what's happening on the border. It also means looking at our economic relationship, looking at fortifying yourself, but also looking at investments that could help you. And it also means, I think, the question of, I don't think, building relationships with people should lead you to an assumption that you're going to fix what the generals in Beijing think. I think it's more a long-term investment, which should also, I think, be looked at as a realist step that you take. So I think you need that kind of a layered response. And I think part of that, to answer your question, is also dialogue. I think one of the striking facts of the last 4 years is that you had not one conversation that we know of, or no structured meeting, barring what you've seen on the sidelines of summits, I think on 2 occasions, between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping, because there's an aversion to speak, because it's seen as that you're taking responsibility and you have something to lose. And I think the other thing is dialogue is seen as a compromise, which need not be the case. If you look at what the US and China do, despite the problems that they have, they still have dialogue at various levels. They have institutionalized mechanisms that for the most part, many of them are still open and working. And I think that we should look at dialogue from a different perspective. I don't think you should be rose-tinted and think that one conversation with Xi is going to fix it. It won't. But I think you need to ask, what do you lose by speaking to him? But having said that, if you ask me, are they going to meet next week, I would say it's unlikely, from what I've seen so far as of today, that they will have a structured conversation, because I think a structured conversation would have been predicated on both of them coming to an arrangement in the last 2 points where they're yet to disengage of the 7 points in Ladakh on the LAC, where they've created buffer zones in 5 of them. They haven't been able to resolve the last 2, and I think India and China resolving the last 2 would have probably been a necessary step for Modi and Xi to meet. I think looking at past summits, sometimes it goes down to the last hour, so you can never say never, but as of today, it seems unlikely that they will meet.
Thank you. So a bleak prognosis for the moment from our panel, but I think what's important is the idea that we can't just shy away from trying to look for some kind of a solution, some kind of a renewal to the ties, just because it seems structurally difficult. I'd like to thank you as an audience, but please a round of applause for our great panel. And thank you. Prabal, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Can I have another round of applause for the